It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum. 4 decades after the presidency of Richard Nixon, America remains fascinated with this figure who was a major player in our national politics for more than 2 decades, had extraordinary achievements in foreign policy, was hugely popular among voters across the country, and once appeared to be a man destined for historical greatness. Yet he came to represent all that we most fear in democracy, a leader carried away by hubris, intolerance, and a thirst for power that propelled him and the entire country to engage in shameful and illegal actions that still haunt us all even today. Our guests in this episode are 3 of the nation's leading scholars on the Nixon presidency who have devoted years of work examining thousands of hours of secretly made recordings in the Nixon Oval Office. Ken Hughes is the author of Chasing Shadows, the Nixon Tapes, the Chenault Affair, and the Origins of Watergate. He also has forthcoming Fatal Politics, the Nixon Tapes, the Vietnam War, and the Casualties of Re-election. Luke NICHTER is a history professor at Texas A&M University and a co-author with Douglas Brinkley of the Nixon Tapes, 1971 to 72. He will shortly publish the Nixon Tapes, 1973. JOHN PRADOS is the author of the White House Tapes, Eavesdropping on the President. He is a historian and senior fellow at the National Security Archive and has written more than 20 books on presidential power, American history, U.S. intelligence, and national security. Thank you for joining us. It's great to have you. And what a fascinating array of books that you bring to us today. Before we start into our conversation about the Nixon presidency and about the tapes that were made during his presidency, let's listen to one sample of those recordings so that we can hear the voice of Nixon, and in this case it's Nixon and Kissinger discussing what will come to be the final resolution of the American involvement in Vietnam. But let's stop for a minute and listen to the voices of Nixon and Henry Kissinger.
I don't hate France, but these guys are scared, and they're desperate, and they know what's coming. And Hughes says that, sure, these proposals keep him going, but somewhere down the road he'll have no choice except to commit suicide, and he's probably right. I mean, we have to be honest, right, among ourselves. I actually think we can settle it on terms, however they are, but not Jews, on close to our terms. And I also think that Hugh is right, that our terms will eventually destroy him.
Our terms will eventually destroy him. That's a really ominous line. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that moment and hear from you 3 what was happening in that context. But then also let's talk more broadly about Vietnam and the Nixon involvement in perpetuating and then bringing it into Vietnam. But start with the tape. Ken, explain to us exactly what that moment was.
This is a pivotal moment in the negotiations over the Vietnam War. It's October 6, 1972. It's the day before Henry Kissinger will fly to Paris to meet with the North Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese are finally going to settle on Nixon's terms. To get South Vietnam ready for this, they have sent General Alexander Haig, Kissinger's deputy, to Saigon to brief the South Vietnamese government on those terms. And the president of South Vietnam was actually in tears, saying, this will destroy our government. It'll keep us going for a while, but at some point I'm going to have to commit suicide. So this tape illustrates, I think, what is most valuable about the Nixon tapes, in that you get to hear Nixon and Kissinger say things, admit things that they would never put in writing, that they denied in their memoirs. Both of them said that they did not pursue a decent interval exit strategy for Vietnam. But this tape and others show that they realized that they were making an agreement that would only keep South Vietnam going for a year or two after Nixon withdrew the last troops. So it really illustrates the time machine quality of the tapes, especially Nixon's tapes, because he had a voice-activated mechanism that basically turned on every time he opened his mouth between February 1971 and July 1973, giving us this really once-in-history account, a near-perfect record of the presidency, at least from the Oval Office perspective.
But so in the decent interval, that phrase that you referred to, and you then just explained it as well, but in even plainer terms, the decent interval was the idea that the U.S. could get out of South Vietnam and things could hold together long enough that it wouldn't be an embarrassment or wouldn't appear to have been a catastrophic loss on the part of the United States, and that was the real Nixon strategy, even though later it's denied. The official version of events is a bit like what the official version of events on Iraq was, that we were leaving behind a new and stable democracy and had helped them build up their military, and that they would be able to hold off entities like ISIS or the Islamic State.
Compelling analogy, Doug.
Yeah, it's an interesting how similarly things have turned out. But
I have to disagree with one thing that Ken said, and that is this idea that the Vietnamese were settling on American terms. I don't think that's correct. I think the reason that Kissinger and Nixon hold the opinion that the terms are going to destroy South Vietnam is because they got to this agreement by agreeing that North Vietnamese troops would not withdraw from South Vietnamese troops to match American troops leaving Vietnam. So
that's true.
The point is...
But that is Americans' terms as of May of 1971. As of May of 1971, when Kissinger negotiated with
my point, though, is that the negotiation only proceeded after the Americans made that concession. That was a concession that the Americans made.
Yeah. And well, that's what I mean by Nixon and Kissinger's terms. The ceasefire in place allowing the North Vietnamese to continue to stay in South Vietnam, which was a concession that they partially made in fall of 1970 and then completely made in May of 1971 in their secret talks.
And so, just so we understand clearly, what that concession was the United States is going to pull its troops out of all of Vietnam, but North Vietnamese forces, which at that stage were in territory of South Vietnam, explain the arrangement.
Right. When Al Haig went to Saigon on that trip that was mentioned, that was for the specific purpose of identifying those terms to the South Vietnamese government, and the response of the two government was North Vietnamese troops must leave South Vietnam or there is no deal.
And Nixon and Kissinger obscured that reality throughout 1971 and 1972. When Nixon made speeches, he talked about all the outside forces leaving South Vietnam, and when
in fact, the North Vietnamese were not going to leave.
He was already conceding that behind the scenes that they would stay.
But also, in this reference to, and there's been this conversation with the premier of South Vietnam, in which he has said, I'll have to commit suicide because of this. There's no way this government can stand. And he's not talking metaphorically, really. No, he's saying that everything's going to collapse and I'm not going to survive this.
I think the conversation is also a timely lesson to us and to really all presidents who are president during wartime that it's a lot easier to get into war than it is to get out of war. And the other thing I think we see in the conversation is that this is a Richard Nixon who has already been to China and has already been to Moscow. He doesn't, whatever value Vietnam had as a negotiating chip with the Chinese or the Russians is now expired. I think at this point you're hearing a Richard Nixon who just wants to get out of Vietnam.
And who wants to get
negotiating chips. Speaking of negotiating chips, what Al Haig has in his briefcase when he goes on this trip is a plan to bomb Hanoi, which has been secretly worked up by the head of the Joint Staff of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
And so that's this last American threat to the North Vietnamese
right.
To try to extract.
So the two can feel better going along with the agreement.
Even though the North Vietnamese don't really believe that, in the end, does that threat actually play a significant part in the final resolution?
My view is that it does not.
I agree.
Yeah, but just the idea, though, that a president and Secretary Kissinger, these two individuals who I think, particularly if we're being charitable to Nixon, but even just in the conventional wisdom about Kissinger, these two quite brilliant minds in terms of the geopolitics particularly of that era. But the idea that there could be in this calculation of this resolution that the people we propped up all this time are inevitably going to collapse. The leader we've worked with will probably not survive this. I mean, could we imagine a similar kind of conversation or equation around the withdrawal from Iraq or some other engagement in contemporary politics? It's sort of hard to imagine that being considered a defensible strategic decision.
It would be considered indefensible at the time either. And both Nixon and Kissinger did not try to defend it. They denied it. But it's clear from the tapes that Nixon kept the war going through 1972 because he was afraid that after he withdrew the American troops, Saigon would fall. And you can hear Nixon and Kissinger as early as the spring of 1971 saying, we'll get out. Nixon sets out a window somewhere between July of 1972 and January of 1973. They time withdrawals, so they'll reach a climax then. And Nixon sticks the landing. He gets all the combat troops out shortly before the election, like right the month when the Republicans renominate him, and he gets the final deal in January 1973. So Nixon and Kissinger are still brilliant geopoliticians, but what's hidden from view, because we generally don't have White House tapes at our disposal, is that they're working geopolitics with an eye towards its effect on domestic politics. And domestic politics wind up wagging the dog.
I think I would add too, going back to your question, the parallel, if there are any, between and the lessons of Vietnam and how we apply them to more recent events, Iraq or Afghanistan, is, I think one thing Richard Nixon realized, and I think with the Nixon tapes you can always cherry pick something to support almost any theory, but I think that when you look at kind of a sufficient sample size, there's another parallel that I see, which is that, some people today say, could we have won the war? Could Nixon have somehow altered strategy and won the war? I think Nixon understood, what does it mean to win the war in Vietnam? What is the definition of success or victory in Vietnam? And I think similarly, you look at Iraq or Afghanistan, I think we've yet to see any politician articulate what it means to have been successful in those places. We know what failure looks like, but I think it's anything but clear what victory or success would have looked like.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. How would we get there and what the real definition of it is, as opposed to, I think we do have an instinctive understanding, and presidents do, of what's a high point, such as mission accomplished in Iraq, and that the big institutions of the designated enemy have been, their machines have been broken, their forces have been scattered. It's a high point. It feels victorious, but it's anything but a secure and lasting victory, and millions of miles away from an actual restoration of a new kind of society where people who've been at war are working together again, which was supposedly the aim in Vietnam as well, and utterly failed at.
Well, this ties in with actually something that I've been thinking about a lot, which is the disappearance of taping as a form of recording information and historical knowledge. And that's been suppressed by new forms of communication, new mechanisms, right? The new form of audio tape, the new White House tapes are going to be the records of video teleconferences that happen between American presidents and their own officials or people from foreign countries. And in the context of what you are just talking about here, my understanding is that George Bush used to have weekly teleconferences with Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, and then those stopped when Barack Obama became president of the United States. So here is a form of evidence that's going to tell us a bit about what the American feeling was and what the American policy was in this new era, but it's going to stop too.
Now that people in the White House don't send each other emails anymore, or issues over whose email, who owns what email, all those kinds of things, it makes you wonder, though, whether we should consider adopting a standard that says everything must be recorded, but that all of that information is shielded for some period of time. It actually can't be obtained, can't be used for prosecution even. You essentially could assert that and say that for 25 years, until 25 years after the end of a presidency, this body of information is sealed, and then it becomes available for historians or something like that.
I say
That
tape them
already
all.
exists. The Presidential Records Act affirmatively asserts a period of 12 years before any material is accessible.
But it doesn't
And then at that
require
point-
it doesn't
at that-
require the recording in the first place.
That's true. I mean, it's not just the law, it's also the courts, and it's also legal cases. The email, for example, White House email was not on the table until my group, the National Security Archive, took the White House to court and got an affirmative judgment that, yes, these emails are public records and they are subject to declassification. And that has opened up, actually, the possibility of having a conversation about Hillary Clinton's email.
What's also amazing to me about all of these kinds of things, yes, thank you, John, for opening up Hillary's emails for us. Thank you. Whatever happens, it's on you. But what I also still marvel at, though, even in this age, and you can see it to some degree, even in the Nixon tapes and the other White House tapes, is that as cautious as people become about these things, and as often as they say, "Oh, I don't ever send emails about this or about that because I don't want anyone to see that," we still email our passwords left and right to one another when our wife needs them. And if you're a cop in Ferguson, Missouri, you still, or a city official, you send a message cracking jokes about the new black president. It's amazing what, even when we know we're creating public records that will be available to people if they want them, or newspaper reporters like me, people still will say the most amazing things.
And you know, that's actually very evident in all these tapes from the White House from the 60s and the 70s. McGeorge Bundy and Dean Rusk and official after official asked, well, didn't you guard your language because there was a taping system? Or did you know there was a taping system? Their responses almost uniformly are, well, I didn't know at the beginning, but after a while I knew, and, well, at first I guarded myself, and after a while I forgot about it.
Well, and I think when the recordings were taking place, they had an expectation they would remain private indefinitely. And people have said, clearly Nixon must have been choreographing some of these conversations. Well, I mean, maybe, but the tapes are more damaging to him than anybody else. And on top of that, it's clear after a while that he forgets where tapings even take place, which locations, which of his offices. So I think it's highly unlikely for that reason that he did choreograph these. The system was installed, it was operated by the Secret Service, and it just ran every day.
Let's go back to Vietnam for a minute and some specifics there. Ken wrote a book, his most recent book, asserting about not the end of Vietnam, with the tape we just heard from, but talking about before Nixon really was even president, the Chenault affair.
The October surprise.
The October surprise, where Nixon is about to be elected president, but it is fearful that he's showing a little bit of weakness at a certain point in the summer before the election, and then this secret sequence of events begins in which, according to Ken, what's happening is the Nixon campaign is sending the message to the North Vietnamese at that point: don't settle, don't reach a deal with the current Democratic administration. Hold off, you'll get a better deal from me. Now that sounds a little bit like what's just happened with a group of U.S. senators, arguably in the United States. But in the case of, as Ken portrays it, with Nixon, this is a private citizen, and what could arguably be a very clear violation of the Wagner Act, a very clearly treasonous act of a presidential candidate undermining this critical negotiation, and as a result of it, perhaps succeeding in that undermining, and at the cost of thousands of additional American lives, because the war was extended considerably longer than it might otherwise have been. But do you buy Ken's interpretation of that sequence of events?
I think there's something there. I mean, clearly, the facts as I understand them is we know the Nixon camp had contact with the South Vietnamese, the embassy, with Anna Chenault. I think, to me, what lacks in terms of the smoking gun is Nixon's direct involvement. We don't know exactly what Nixon's involvement was, when, was he issuing orders, was he involved in meetings or phone calls. We can assume John Mitchell, his campaign manager, was involved. But to me, what's lacking is knowing exactly what Nixon said and what he wanted to happen.
And that's what frustrated LBJ, because he strongly suspected that Nixon was behind it. Anna Chennault implied that Nixon was behind it. It's the explanation that makes the most sense, because the South Vietnamese clearly took these messages very seriously. But while LBJ sometimes implied, when he was talking to the Senate Majority Leader Everett Dirksen, or even to Nixon himself, that he had the goods, he really didn't. He had the goods on Chennault, but not on Nixon.
But there is a particular recording, right? Is it where in which Johnson is describing this to Nixon directly, isn't he? And saying, and he's sort of offering up the possibility that this must be going on independent of Nixon himself. But the message is that candidate Nixon needs to curb his to curb his operatives because it's treason. I mean, that's what LBJ is essentially saying, that if this is actually happening, it's treason. And Nixon does not say, "Oh, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, Mr. President."
To me, another thing, one of the mysteries of this whole episode is that if one political party had evidence of treason against the other, this idea that instead of using that for political gain in an election year, during the middle of an October surprise, but no, it's for the better of the country that we seal this for 50 years. I just don't buy that. I mean, I think if the tables were reversed and Republicans had evidence of Democratic treason, they would have put it to good use in some form.
That's one of the fascinating LBJ conversations, because the day before the 1968 election, LBJ gets his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor, and his Secretary of Defense on the phone. And is like, should we reveal this? The Christian Science Monitor has a story. And the Secretary of State, a Democrat, the National Security Advisor, another Democrat, Clark Clifford, the Secretary of Defense, a very big Democrat, going back to the Truman administration, all advise him not to. Because they say, well, we don't have the goods on Nixon himself, and if we put it out, we could destroy his presidency before it begins. They're worried that Nixon would enter office as a crippled president. So it is kind of interesting to hear guys who are Democratic partisans, include LBJ in that, saying, well, we probably should hold off on this because it does too much damage and we don't have enough proof.
Can we imagine
such a thing
in current times? I mean, can you possibly imagine in our current politics one side deciding for the good of the country not to destroy the other side? Wow, that is unthinkable.
And by the way, Clark Clifford was a big partisan back in those days. I have a very ironic note to add to that, and that is I was part of a U.S. delegation in Hanoi in 1997 meeting with these former Vietnamese officials in a conference about the missed opportunities of the Vietnam War. And when the question of a peace deal came up, the negotiations came up, the North Vietnamese position was that we had made a big mistake because the same deal that we achieved in 1973 was on the table in 1968.
Yeah, so it's very fair to say that the war could have ended at that point on the same terms, and you could maybe this is being a little artificial, but it is not ginning up a drama to say that the lives lost between that moment and the actual end of the war could very likely have been those lost lives could have been prevented.
A clarification, I should say, the North Vietnamese weren't saying that those specific terms were on the table. They were saying that they were open to an agreement of that type.
I'm not sure what to believe, and there's evidence that conflicts, and there's still records that we're waiting to be opened on this.
But so what does this whole body of evidence tell us about the presidency itself? Is this a reflection of how most presidencies work, or the issues that every president confronts in terms of the information they have at any particular moment, their ability to control or not control or interact with events that are happening in the world? But what does do the tapes tell us about the reality of the presidency?
I think listening to Nixon and also Johnson and to a lesser extent Kennedy, the presidency on the tapes is a very reactive thing. The day's headlines play a very large role in the president's attention. Also, it's a very politically oriented thing. All the presidents are concerned with how they are doing at that particular moment. They're capable of making long-term plans, and they stick to them. but they're constantly getting new things that they have to respond to, and they're always working with only partial information and about issues that they only have partial expertise on. It's kind of funny listening to Nixon discuss economic matters and say to multiple advisors, I don't really understand this, but I do understand that if prices go up this much, we're not going to be here. And what can we do about that?
I think we all know. I mean, Richard Nixon's a strange man. People like that don't typically reach the presidency. And sometimes I wonder, do we know that or think that because it's true, or because we just have all these recordings of him that we don't have of anyone else? And it's something we don't really have the answer to. I think one of the things that shows to me, I agree with Ken that you see Nixon constantly reacting, and he doesn't have the information he needs to make even really critical decisions. He's pressing for more information, and he often is acting upon incomplete information. I think the presidency, we see the best example of this, is an impossible job. And we have leaders at the highest level, and I think that's a timeless lesson to us about the presidency, because the amount of information has only increased over time in the last 40 years. It's an impossible job, and a president makes difficult decisions every day in a moment with incomplete information.
I think one of the most revelatory things about these tapes is that whatever else their differences, Nixon, Johnson, Kennedy, Eisenhower, and Franklin Roosevelt secretly recorded conversations. I mean, by the standards of normal behavior, this is odd.
That is true.
But presumably, in all of a commonality between all of them was a sense of their own greatness, a sense of a place in history, wanting there to be a record from which they could then shape a version of that history themselves. And to some degree, presidents always seem to, in the abstract, believe that it's important, at the beginning, they tend to believe it's important that there be a really good record of my presidency because it's going to be so great. And then as events unfold and things get more complicated, they seem less enamored of having Taylor Branch come to the White House and talk to them every night.
After the election, LBJ, well, presidents always have orientation meetings with the new president-elect, right? So after the election, LBJ has his orientation meeting with Richard Nixon, and they get aside, they go aside in private, and LBJ tells him, you ought to have a taping system, right? You'll find it great for historical purposes, right? That was exactly the argument that he used. And then Mr. Nixon entered the White House and ordered the taping system that LBJ had ripped out, and the Secret Service took it out. But fast forward 2 years, Richard Nixon gets his own system installed.
Interesting. After President Obama was elected, at the time I was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and I had done a good bit of coverage on the 2008 campaign. And through an intermediary, I made attempted to make a proposal to the White House that I write a series of books about the Obama presidency and somehow become a fly on the wall in the White House with an agreement that I would not write any of this until after the presidency had ended. So essentially I was saying, I'll quit my job at the Wall Street Journal, I'll actually be able to finance that somehow for the next 8 years, presumably, I can just hang out at the White House and then write these books after this has all happened. Now, it didn't go anywhere. But one of the things that came up in the course of that proposal was I found out that there was a law school classmate of President Obama's who had already made a somewhat less elaborate offer of something similar to this that the Obama folks had agreed to, as I understand it. And this guy, who was an established attorney somewhere, I won't say who it was, but sort of abandoned his place in life, moved to Washington, D.C., moved his family there in anticipation of something along these lines. And then at about 2 years into the presidency, I believe it's the case that he had never yet had a meeting with the president. And the whole thing fell apart. And so that it underscores, though, this idea that at the beginning, when there's really a great sense of history around it, they're very open to the idea of a complete and total accounting of what's going to happen. But then as reality sets in, it's much harder to live with that.
Well, I think you saw with Nixon. I mean, what happened once the taping system was in place is the traditional practice of if I'm meeting with you, you have your note taker, I have my note taker, we both have a record of the meeting, even if they're slightly different, the way we interpreted things. But what the taping system allowed Nixon to do is to say, no, let's have an intimate meeting. No note takers, no staff present. Of course, Nixon has the only copy of the meeting. And so that's one of the really rich things about the Nixon tapes is we have a number of meetings, such as Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev in 1973, where the tape, in many cases, is the only record we have of the meeting.
There seems to be, among many people, a view that yes, Nixon did some very bad things, but really maybe what he did was not that much worse than a lot of other presidents. It was just that there was the cover-up and that's what he was really engaged in, and that in the end, he was someone trying to do the right thing, maybe not as great a guy as we would like, but not that extraordinary in terms of the bad actions that he was associated with. He just got caught. There's a lot of people who at times have espoused some sort of a view. Do the tapes in any way bear up that depiction of Nixon?
No, I think the tapes show a person who is actively engaged, not so much as a conspiracy, but in a purposeful exercise of power to gain ends that he has decided are the ones that he wants. A good example of this, I think, is actually the Freedom of Information Act. You know, the Freedom of Information Act today, the provisions of law that require government agencies to release information were actually instituted, believe it or not, by Richard Nixon. But the reason that they exist was because Mr. Nixon wanted to tar John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert, until Robert was dead, and then his brother Ted after that, with the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in Vietnam. And he thought he could achieve that by means of forcing the CIA to release a series of records. Plus, he thought he could add to that by condemning them for going after Castro at the Bay of Pigs. So the CIA refused to give up these records, at which point Mr. Nixon issued an executive order which put in place a system for mandatory declassification of government documents. And the purpose for that was to force the CIA to give him the information to go after the Kennedys. And we know this because he talks about it on tapes.
I think where Nixon was different and set himself apart was the creation of the White House Plumbers. You know, that went beyond just the research, the opposition research teams of Kennedy and Johnson. He internalized a kind of operational capability in the White House that prior to that, a president would use or abuse, in some cases, the FBI or the CIA. By putting that in the White House, when things went wrong, the person who had to take the blame was Richard Nixon. And so I think that's what sets himself apart from his predecessors, too.
The thing that bothers me about trying to decide whether Nixon is especially bad or more of the same is that he's the only one we've got the data for. He's the only guy we've got these tapes on. And so I think I just have to give a big I don't know what the other presidents did.
Yeah, and the question I'm asked a lot is, let's forget Watergate happened. Where does Nixon stand in the kind of pantheon of presidents? Would he be above average, below average? And it's really it's a little different discussion. I think it still would have been a controversial presidency. You still had questions of 1968 that we've talked about. You had expansion of the war in Cambodia. It clearly would have been a controversial presidency even without Watergate. But certainly, if you can pretend that didn't happen, I think Nixon, the American people did choose him twice. And I think each time they got something that surprised them, each election. But I think, I think we would view him a little bit differently without Watergate, certainly.
What do you think about that, John? I mean, I wonder if you guys are being a little overly clinical in this particular analysis, but what do you think?
Well, I'm on the spot here, huh? I think that the Nixon presidency was flawed. I think it was flawed fundamentally by the character of the individuals. I think that Nixon had certain purposes, and we've talked about some of them. We haven't mentioned really too much the idea of opening with China or negotiating with the Russians. And so some of his purposes were, and not to mention single-payer health insurance was something that he was standing for. So he had positive policy prescriptions that he was interested in. But I also think that the flaws in character and the political gamesmanship, really, that he engaged in cheapened and worsened those objectives and finally destroyed his presidency.
And do the tapes reflect on the widely held view that that those behaviors, that if we play armchair psychologist, that they relate to his deep sense of insecurity, this profound sense of insecurity, and kind of this emotionally damaged man that then leads to some of these impulsive conspiratorial actions on his part? I mean, did the tapes give us any affirmation of that psychological profile, or something that contradicts it?
I really don't like doing the psychological profiles because I have no skill at it, and it's
All
hard
you have to do is watch NCI.
it's impossible.
CIS.
What I find is that Nixon generally has a rational explanation. Not always. He's sometimes a conspiracy theorist, but even when he's a conspiracy theorist, he's got some information that worries him. And generally what he does is explicable politically. He's a political genius, flat out. And to the extent that he has good information, he can make sound political decisions. He makes unsound decisions when he has some very bad information, such as the information that the Brookings Institution has a file on the 1968 bombing halt, and he decides he needs that so much he's going to put together a team that will break in and get it. But he was kind of rational to be afraid of such a file if only it had existed.
And what you just referred to is the origins of Watergate from the subtitle of your book. That you're saying that that this inception of the whole
of
the Plumbers and what leads to Watergate ultimately, that it begins with Nixon's fear that the Brookings Institute has a file that would confirm this tampering with the negotiations with the North Vietnamese before he becomes president.
That would have the kind of documents that LBJ implied he had when he spoke to
implicate Nixon. Now, do you, Luke, what's your view on whether, is the line that clear that the beginnings of what leads us to Watergate is a fear over these phantom documents ultimately?
Well, I think it is. You could ask some historians will say you have to go back to George Washington to understand this. But no, I think...
Don't say that.
But, not trying to be, overly clinical. We've been talking about a person's character and their behavior. I think it is more complicated than that, because I don't think it was an event that we can point to. I think, Nixon is someone who, name a modern president who had more linear training for the Oval Office. The House, the Senate, 8 years under Eisenhower, a long period to formulate his policies in the wilderness during the 1960s. And I think that it was before that. I think you see the seeds of Watergate very early on in the presidency, during a period that we don't have taping, including of the meeting with Elvis Presley, and perhaps the greatest loss to history.
There is a picture, though.
There is a photo.
Great picture, yes.
But I think you want to go back a couple of years earlier to a period that wasn't taped. You have a domestic intelligence plan, the Houston Plan, which is still classified top secret today. You have the trail end of FBI programs involving domestic surveillance and intelligence. I think the seeds were in place. I think the creation of the Plumbers kind of centralized those seeds, nurtured them, and ultimately were Nixon's downfall.
And well, here's where presidential records are important, and presidential records written broadly, not just talking about tapes, because actually the records for the Nixon administration show that before there was a taping system, he was already engaged in a program of systematically paring down the opposition for the 1972 election. He did things like, and the documents for this exist, he did things like invite Hubert Humphrey to the White House for a tete-a-tete session, sit Humphrey down and talk about how he really needed Humphrey's support for his negotiations in Vietnam. They would agree on what Humphrey could do to help him. Humphrey would go off and do that, and then Nixon issued orders to his minions to cut down Humphrey for what he had just done for Mr. Nixon. So this attitude, this purposeful activity predates the taping and the Plumbers.
Yeah.
Let's talk for a minute about Kissinger. And we started with a recording of Kissinger and Nixon. I do have the impression from what you guys have written and other things I've seen and the tapes themselves that the picture, the in-the-room picture of Kissinger that we get from the tapes is rather different than the Kissinger who has described himself in his many memoirs and the public statements that he's made. Even that recording that we heard at the beginning of the program describes something that Kissinger, I think, has repeatedly said was in fact not the case, that was not the calculation and that was not a recognition being made by the Nixon administration at that point in time. But so do the tapes make Kissinger out to be a pathological liar?
They show him to be as involved in political calculations, or almost as involved in political calculations as Nixon.
But then also someone who has misrepresented those political calculations for 40 years since then. I mean,
Yes.
Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes.
So if that makes him a pathological liar, then the answer is yes.
He could be a simple liar.
Perhaps not pathological,
Yeah.
just consistent liar.
Kissinger clearly wrote in his 3,500 pages of memoirs that he's really tried to debunk the tapes over the years. In his memoirs, he said the tapes have no historical value because how is it fair that one person knows they exist and everyone else in the room is being secretly recorded? But I can tell you, behind closed doors, that he's very interested in the tapes. And you've seen a kind of change of tone in him in the last year or two. Now that more and more of the tapes have been published and are in the hands of the public, I think this debate over does Kissinger take credit for this or does Nixon take credit for this or blame on either one, I think we have less ambiguity about these questions now. And now that the recordings are being used by historians and the public, he can't stick to the status quo that he wrote 30 years before, that they have no value.
I'd love to hear a judge's response to a defendant saying, it's not fair to use the tape of my DUI stop to convict me because I didn't know the tape was being made. Something
Kissinger
tells me
has
that
his
would not
own
work.
Tapes. Kissinger has his own tapes, right? Kissinger employed a platoon of note-takers to record verbatim memos of his telephone conversations, which he then put in Rockefeller's vault to shield from U.S. records. Talk about Hillary Clinton's emails, Richard Nixon's tapes. Henry Kissinger did this exact thing. Those phone records went into Rockefeller's vault, were shielded from the National Archives, were kept out of the declassification system for decades. And again, it's a court process suing for access to those tapes that has brought them to the light of the public.
And did the tapes, what did they add or subtract from conventional wisdom about what they reflect on?
I would say that Kissinger appears the way he would like to appear.
Yep.
There was actually a very funny article in a magazine, a defunct now magazine, that was a sort of Washington Insider type magazine, which was written by a gentleman who worked for the State Department, who was one of these scribes. And he talks about how at the beginning, they had this sense of responsibility, and they were like working so hard on the dead key, right, to listen to the conversations and record what they were saying. But over time, as Kissinger or other managers would come to them and say, well, this record needs more humor, or this record needs more of this. They began to think of themselves as creative writers. And they actually started wearing jackets that had those elbow pads.
Yeah, I think so. Whether it's the Nixon tapes, the Kissinger tapes, and there's the Bob Haldeman tapes, his recorded diaries.
Yes.
And the nice thing about the Kissinger, we only have Nixon tapes from 71 to 73. Of Kissinger and Haldeman diaries for periods where there was no taping. So I think when you look at any topic, you have to compare all the available evidence. It's really easy to take one and cherry pick and make the evidence fit your narrative.
We've only got a few minutes left, but let's take some of that time to talk about China and the Soviet Union, in particular the opening to China. These great achievements of the Nixon presidency, that maybe the most positive things that were accomplished in that period of time. What do the tapes tell us about the opening to China, and in particular, not to put too sharp a point on it, I'm just curious, was the Nixon White House in close contact with members of the Senate and Congress and letting them know about everything that was going on as these negotiations were occurring and inviting the Congress to essentially going with the presumption that we'll need Congress to sign off on any sort of a arrangement we make with China? Do the tapes show a process like that?
My view on the tapes is that I think it's possible that we've given Nixon too much credit for the opening to China. And it's not to take away from the achievement, but it's because, the idea that we established relations with this nation that we had no contact with for over 20 years, the reason that relations improved was because they wanted that too. And the idea that we give all the credit to Nixon and Kissinger sort of suggests the Chinese had no role. And in fact, what the tapes show, and a few of these conversations are in this book, is that when Zhou Enlai, whether it was inviting the ping pong team over from Tokyo, visiting the beginning of ping pong diplomacy, or whether it was various kind of minor trade agreements that were designed to test the possibility for larger political agreements to come, I think Nixon and Kissinger are repeatedly surprised by how well things are going in the Oval Office. They're the ones that are supposed to be controlling the levers of policymaking, but yet China is actually taking the initiative in a number of cases. But because a lot of the Chinese archives aren't available and aren't open the way that ours are more open, I think the story will evolve over time and show that China really took the lead at key moments.
But isn't the great credit that's given to Nixon not so much in the initiation of those discussions, but the willingness of an American president to do this, what might have been an unthinkable act a very short time before that, to have any sort of engagement along these lines with either China or the Soviet Union? That was really the moment of great political character, you could argue, on the part of Nixon, to realize that it has to be a conservative like me who is willing to go against the Cold War grain. That's what made it a brave act. I mean, is that part of the story legitimate, not reasonable?
It is. I think so. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier about having purposes and having good objectives going into the White House. There's a Nixon article in Foreign Affairs magazine in the mid-'60s that foreshadows the opening to China. And actually, here is something that is written by a person who was among the most anti-communist figures in the administration that he left, that of Dwight Eisenhower, and talking, almost a decade in advance about better relations with China. So yes, there are good goals there.
There is also a cute tape in which Nixon declares that only Nixon could go to China. He was the one who first came up with that particular insight.
Well, I think 40 years later, we're still trying to digest, how good of a thing was this? I mean, obviously the relationship with U.S. and China is complicated, to say the very least. I think in Nixon's mind, I think he understood that it was complicated at the time. But Nixon, I thought, Nixon wanted to improve relations with the Soviet Union for the short term, for the near term, 5 years. His goal with China was the long game, 20 years, 25 years, that it's much better to make peace with the world's largest nation on our terms than get to a point 20 or 25 years from now when they will run things and we have no choice but to make peace on their terms. So I think he deserves credit for that idea. I think it's innovative. The idea wasn't new. Presidents before Nixon had talked about improving relations, but it was Nixon who really made the move and was able to make the move.
Yeah, so deserves credit for the courage that was required in that. It reflects in another way on the president, I think, that's interesting to think about, and that is that in that era, this whole sequence of presidents, all of whose view on the world and their interpretation of the limits of their behavior, how far they can go, the sorts of things they could attempt or not attempt, are overwhelmingly driven by the Cold War framework, the idea that there is this persistent existential threat to the existence of the United States and humanity, that the stakes are very large, there's great risk, and so that has a disciplining effect on the geopolitics and to some degree the politics itself, and respect for the presidency, that we can't undermine this person who represents us in this confrontation with the other side that the humanity hangs in the balance. Then when the Cold War goes away, when that very melodramatic context goes away, we begin to have a kind of politics that we have today, in which, at least this would be my interpretation, I'm curious if you agree with it, that without that existential threat, it has unleashed some of these more juvenile and destructive forces in our domestic politics. Does that seem reasonable, just based on the way things worked as the tapes portrayed them in that earlier era?
Yeah, Nixon on the tapes, he compares the process of improving relations with China to improving relations with already well-established allies in Europe. And he says, surprisingly on the tapes, that improving relations with China was much easier than improving relations with, and he uses this analogy of the family. You know, when you have a family, you know each other too well, and you have disagreements and you have fights. And I think early on, when you're getting to know each other, there's a certain euphoria that drives actions and behaviors on both sides, and both sides clearly wanted to improve relations. So I think I'm not surprised, and I don't think Nixon would be surprised, that we've entered a more complicated phase in the relationship with China, because we do know each other a lot better. And these aren't secret talks happening anymore, with Kissinger faking Delhi belly and traveling through India and Pakistan. These are out in the open. They're much more highly scrutinized, and I think the stakes are much higher.
I think every 4 years, anybody who wants to be president is well advised to come up with an existential threat to the United States. It is useful politically for everybody running for president to say, these guys, the incumbents, the opposition party, is leaving us open to a threat that will destroy us or at least make us weak. And it's very hard for people to make the argument, well, there's not much we can do about it. You know, George Marshall, as great a patriot as anyone could ever prove himself to be, a World War II hero, tried to make the case in the 1950s that we couldn't save China. But that case, however true, just did not fly with the voters. Voters don't want to hear that there are problems that we can't solve. And politicians can make themselves look strong and brave and trustworthy by saying that they, you know, if only they were in power, they would have been able to make those problems go away. So I think
really
there's built-in irresponsibility.
Another parallel often drawn between the present times and a part of the Nixon period is if we go back to 1968 and try to compare it to the present in terms of domestic politics, that we are often under the belief, and people will often say that we're in a more divided time than ever before, that the level of bitterness of American politics at present is unprecedented. And this really isn't, I'm going to foreclose you from doing what almost every historian does, and that is to say, oh, but you're forgetting the election of 1801 and the terrible things said about Thomas Jefferson. Let's put all that aside and stay in the modern era. But in 1968 and the beginning of the Nixon presidency, for sure, there was tremendous turmoil in the country. There was already this three-way split between one kind of conservatism and then another kind of conservatism. Then it was Democrats, but that had a more racial tone to it, and then the other, the more liberal Democratic Party. But the divisions that today look like Republicans, Democrats, and the Tea Party, there was a version of that in 1968 in that period of time. Nixon ends up, had it not been for Watergate, being a rather successful president in many respects and working through this divided political time. Or let me just ask you, did he manage that sort of division in the country any better or worse than we see it being managed by a president today?
He made the division work for him. And in 1972, he got together a huge coalition. He was able to say, here are the problems. The problems are the liberals undermining us in foreign policy and being weak in domestic policy, too, as far as things like law and order goes. And for a brief period, he got a big coalition against the problems as he defined them. And after he did that, he kind of set the standard, the blueprint for future Republican presidential nominees, and so to that extent, he was kind of successful. That whether that's good for the country or not, I find it impossible to say because there are good things and bad things about it.
Let's get quick final thoughts from each of you. Yeah.
I think it was clear, no matter who took control of the White House on January 20th, 1969, it wasn't going to be an easy job. The experience of the 60s and the Vietnam War, and in particular 68, I think it was going to be rough no matter who captured the election that year. You know, I think in summary, the big picture, not all division is bad. You know, there are MSNBC viewers, there are Fox News viewers. You know, we expect to have some division. I think it's when it goes beyond a healthy degree of division. Have we over-gerrymandered our Congress? Have we set ourselves up for an unhealthy amount of division, I think that we can have a real debate about that.
The political controversies over Vietnam and the division of the American people over Vietnam and the opposition to the war rising and becoming centralized specifically in 1968 because of the events of 1968, that in fact the political problem that Richard Nixon faced on January 21st, 1969 was probably an order of magnitude more complex than any of his predecessors, at least in the modern era, had faced. And if you look at it from that perspective, Mr. Nixon's ability to manage, if that's the right word, these American politics was amazing.
So astonishingly, we end on a positive note for Richard Nixon. Thank all three of you for being here. These are wonderful books, wonderful work. It's really been fascinating to talk with you. To learn more about these authors and their books, to send us a comment, to download a podcast of this and other episodes of American Forum, or to read a transcript, visit us at millercenter.org, where American Forum is always available. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next time.